Hello and welcome to Shipwrecks and Sea Dogs, Tales of Mishaps, Misfortune, and Misadventure. I'm your host, Rich Napolitano. With me today is Ronan Rooney, host of the Wrangell History Unlocked podcast, to discuss one of the worst maritime disasters in American history, the Star of Bengal. Ronan, thank you so much for joining me today.
Thank you so much for having me.
Before we get into the story, could you tell us a little bit about you and your podcast?
Sure, my name is Ronan Rooney. I run a podcast called Wrangell History Unlocked and a website, wrangellhistoryunlocked.com, that is the history of my hometown, Wrangell, a small little island in southeast Alaska. Though I don't live there anymore, I'm very sentimental and affectionate for it. So this was my COVID-19 lockdown hobby that I've just kept going ever since.
You made a multi part series about the Star of Bengal, and it goes into a fantastic degree of detail. But here today, we'll do more of an overview, hit the main points of the story. So, for starters, let's talk about the ship itself. When and where was the Star of Bengal built?
So the Star of Bengal was built in Belfast, Ireland by Harland and Wolff, who are most famous as the builders of the Titanic. The Star of Bengal was released in 1874 for a shipping magnate out of Belfast named J.P. Corey, who that same year was appointed to the British Parliament. That's also the same exact year that Britain fully controls India. So J.P. Corey, a shipping magnate, sees an opportunity to extract as much wealth from India as he possibly can, and so that's where the Star of Bengal comes along. It is effectively a great big truck. It has a giant hold in the center, very little accommodations for crew, but lots of space to fill up with things like grain and salt, coal, all sorts of things that Corey could then ship off to markets around the world.
Now, this was a time of declining use of sailing ships, obviously. It was steamships had long since been introduced at this point in time, but sailing ships were really starting to fall out of favor as, in terms of commercial shipping. How did this impact the Star of Bengal?
So the rise of steamships really did change the landscape of nautical navigation. J.P. Corey was old school. He was not interested in this newfangled technology. Even though Harland and Wolff tried to talk him into putting a steam engine inside of his ships, J.P. Corey trusted sails. And so the Star of Bengal, 1874, was a product of the golden age of sail, where science and engineering really pushed the boundaries of what you could build. And the Star of Bengal served its purpose, but by the end of the 1800s, it was a relic because steamships were so much better at doing the job of transportation. The Star of Bengal was sold to an owner that put it in Hawaii right at the time the Hawaiian royal government fell, and eventually that's how the Star of Bengal became an American ship.
And it went through a period where it was refitted, I believe. What kind of changes were made to it after a time?
So in the early 20th century, the Star of Bengal really didn't have much of a future. In fact, it was stored in San Francisco, where a lot of the city of San Francisco at that time was built from scrap parts of old sailing ships. Old sailing ships were truly relics, more useful in pieces. And so the owners, figuring we need to make this ship cheaper to sell and cheaper to operate, stripped third mast on the ship in the back of its spars and everything and turned it from a three-masted sailing ship into a bark. And it was that way for the rest of its life.
For those who may not know, a three masted or fully rigged ship has all square rigged sails, the traditional old Spanish ship that you might envision. And a bark has two of those, but then usually the rear sail is fore and aft rigged and not square sailed, just to cut through a little bit of the maritime jargon there for listeners. So you mentioned the Star of Bengal was involved in shipping grain. Did it continue shipping the same kind of products after it was refitted?
Shortly after it was refitted, they found a buyer, another San Francisco company, the Alaska Packers Association, which was effectively a salmon trust. It was based out of San Francisco. It was operated by Henry Fortman, who was the president of the company for around 30 years. Uh, but the company operated canneries all throughout Alaska and one in Washington. And their big goal was at the end of the summer, they needed to transport canned salmon from Alaska, from the canneries, down to San Francisco. And so a company like that, they don't care about a ship that might be a little bit slower. They don't mind because their product is shelf stable. Canned salmon is literally good for years and years. So it continued to be a shipping vessel and it became a salmon shipping vessel.
The Alaska Packers Association brought the Star of Bengal to Wrangell. How did the seasonal nature of the industry there impact the or what how does that play a part in this story?
So the Alaska Packers Association, it really starts in the early 1890s. What they had initially was lots of independent canneries scattered throughout Alaska in these small little ports that were competing against each other. They would catch salmon all summer long, and then they would can it, and they'd put it on ships and bring it to markets in places like Seattle, Portland, San Francisco. And all these independent canneries would compete against each other and drive the price of their product down, slashing the price, effectively selling the same exact product with no real advantage over the competitor. So the formation of the Alaska Packers Association was effectively a monopoly, collusion, a trust, a way for these competitors to bind together so they could set a fixed price for canned salmon that they could then sell at the market. So, what does that really mean for Alaska? Uh, for some people, it meant some jobs, seasonal work in the summers, but mostly it meant jobs for people based out of San Francisco who would take these seasonal jobs. They'd come up to Alaska, they'd work the summer, and then they would come back down. It's not too dissimilar from what you might have heard about today, where people come to Alaska, they work a summer job in the fisheries, and then they go back home to wherever it is that they actually live. The APA is really the beginning of that model.
That reminds me of organizations like the Dutch East India Company or the British East India Company basically did the same thing. They were competing with each other and then decided, hey, let's just make a gang and we'll control the market. And that's
Yeah,
basically how that worked.
totally works.
So, what was the town of Wrangell like? What was life like in 1908?
1908 Wrangell, Alaska is a very small town, barely 1,000 people. It had just incorporated as a city. It was still largely Tlingit. That's the indigenous population that's in Wrangell. And for years, it had been one of Alaska's leading cities. The Army built a fort there in the late 1860s. It had been the site of the first gold rush in Alaska in 1861, and then another one in 1874, and then the Klondike gold rush came through in 1898. So Wrangell's economy had already been boom and bust and boom and bust. So here came canned salmon that was seasonal, yeah, but it was stable. It was the kind of thing that could operate year over year and expand. So for a town like Wrangell, canned salmon was an economic lifeline.
So, let's talk about the fateful day now, September 20th, 1908. Walk us through that day with the Star of Bengal.
So it's the end of the long summer canning season. You've got the Star of Bengal that has been tied up at a dock all summer long. Meanwhile, the cannery itself is buzzing with activity. You've got Chinese, Japanese, Filipino cannery workers processing salmon. You've got a lot of European immigrants who are the fishermen, who are on smaller tugboats and steamboats, who are spending their summer out at fish traps all around Southeast Alaska, gathering up salmon from the fish traps, bringing it to the cannery for the cannery workers to process and turn into canned salmon. So by the end of that canning season, people are ready to relax. They're ready for a break. They're exhausted from long hours. Canning is late hours. You work until the fish are processed because they'll spoil. So it's a really tough job, even today. On September 19th, the ships begin the formation that will be the fateful final voyage of the Star of Bengal. The Star of Bengal, in order to weave through the somewhat narrow and precarious islands of Southeast Alaska, the Star of Bengal is towed. It's towed by two steamships operated by the Alaska Packers Association. There is on the port side the lead towing ship called the Hattie Gage, and then opposite that is another steamship called the Kayak. And instead of the ship that normally towed the Star of Bengal through those islands called the Chilkat, which was much bigger, the APA substituted two smaller steamships to tow the Star of Bengal out to sea that night on September the 19th, 1908. And that was the fatal mistake that would eventually lead to the disaster.
So, what happened with the tugboats as far as it was a mistake for them to be used in that situation? What caused the problem?
So everyone who was there, all the eyewitness testimony and the stories that wound up in newspapers and the recollections from years later, everyone remarked how peaceful and still and quiet the morning of September 19th was. Clear water, clear skies. It was just so nice. And there was actually something of a rowdy party the night before. Everyone in the cannery, people got drunk. People stayed up late. People had a raucous party because all anybody had to do the next morning was shuffle onto a boat and take a long voyage back home to San Francisco. So the morning of the 19th, people are not even thinking about anything related to a disaster. The effect of picking these two smaller steamships to take the Star of Bengal out to sea, it was not a problem in fair weather. But what the ships encountered as they wove their way through the islands of Southeast Alaska, and just as they make it to the open sea late on the night of September 19th, is the freshening of the wind. And then the rain starts coming in. And they realize, when it's almost too late, that there is a fierce gale coming off of the open ocean. And these ships are struggling to tow the Star of Bengal against it. In fact, the wind is so powerful that it's causing magnificent, terrific, steep waves. And the two ships towing the Star of Bengal are able to communicate with each other. The Hattie Gage, which is the lead tow, is actually a little bit smaller than the Kayak. The Hattie Gage is able to pull the Star of Bengal, but what's happening to the Kayak is that it has a very high stern. Just the way the ship was built. The stern is so high that as it bobs in the waves, the stern comes out and people can see the propeller. People can see the rudder. And a ship with its propeller out of the water might as well be a buoy or a piece of driftwood. It cannot navigate. It's useless. And so the Hattie Gage is pulling in one direction and the Kayak is drifting off to another. Meanwhile, the storm is pushing this configuration of ships closer and closer to the eastern side of Coronation Island, which is where the Star of Bengal ultimately winds up.
Was it pushed up against a reef or into the rocks? What was the fate of the ship?
So the first sign of danger that everybody observed, we're talking the two towboats and the Star of Bengal, is that they could suddenly hear the sound of breakers. They can hear the sound of the sea crashing against the rocks. And we're talking, it's the middle of the night. It's pitch dark. The moon is not out. And it's windy and it's raining. But they can hear the breakers against the rocks. And so, try as they might, the two steamships try to pull the Star of Bengal away from the rocks. But they just can't do it. And then suddenly, the skippers aboard the two towboats, they're getting reports from their crew members that they can see rocks 20 yards off of the sides of their ships. And they know this is catastrophic. We've come too close to Coronation Island. And so, in an act of desperation to save themselves, the captains of the Hattie Gage and the Kayak order the crew to cut the tow line that's holding the Star of Bengal. What the captains of the towboats don't realize, though, is that the Star of Bengal has been measuring the fathoms of water underneath. And at 17 fathoms of water, Captain Nicholas Wagner of the Star of Bengal orders the Star of Bengal to drop both of its anchors. So there in the dark, in the confusion, the two tugboats flee for their lives, and the Star of Bengal sits at anchor right off the edge of Coronation Island.
Meanwhile, the wind and the waves, I'm sure, are pummeling the ship. And the dangers of being in such a situation, the ship could be swamped. It could strike a reef or some shoals and damage the hull. This is what is the ultimate fear of these captains about running aground.
Absolutely. In fact, the captains of the towboats were convinced as they were cutting the hawser lines, they were convinced that the Star of Bengal was already wrecked. They thought that has to be it. There's no chance for the Star of Bengal. But miraculous, the Star of Bengal actually sits at anchor for hours until sunrise. As the towboats flee for their lives, the Star of Bengal is actually still floating. It's sitting there, it's at the anchors, but it is precariously close to the rocks, and the weather is still pushing it towards the shore.
And of course, anchors don't always hold. A lot of shipwrecks happen when the currents and the wind is so strong that they get dragged, and they'll get dragged right into shore, right into the rocks, or some other kind of obstacle, and that's what poses so much danger to a ship and being in such a storm. So
Absolutely. And that happens in the case of the Star of Bengal. The captain and the crew are very aware that the anchors are dragging, and we're talking enormous anchors.
yeah.
So it really speaks to the storm that night, that the ship was still being pushed even though it had dropped the anchors.
So what happened next?
So that all happens around 4 in the morning. 4 in the morning is around the time that the hawsers cut their lines and the Star of Bengal sits at anchor. At this point, there's controversy. From this point on, and even to this day, despite all the research I've done and the story I've tried to tell, there's still debate about who's responsible and what happens next. The crew is pretty universal in the fact, and even the captain, Nicholas Wagner of the Star of Bengal, admits that he went with his megaphone and shouted to the captains to come back. The captain of the Star of Bengal shouted into the darkness, shouted into the storm for hours, such that he lost his voice. So when the sun came up about 6 in the morning, the captain's voice is very hoarse and very difficult for him to communicate. And he's clearly very emotional. He's very angry at the captains of the tugboats, and that would never end. He would, for the rest of the story, he would continue to despise them and hold them accountable for everything that happened. Around a little after 6 a.m., the crew can see that they are about 600 yards or so from the shore. And there's a small little bight that they've been brought into. If they were 100 yards to the north or 100 yards to the south, they might have wrecked already. But as it is, they're actually in a little pocket of water. And so to test if there's any chance that the sea would push lifeboats towards shore, they take a ladder from the ship and they throw it overboard. And they watch the ladder drift naturally towards the beach. And they think, this is our chance. We're going to be able to put lifeboats in the water and the current will take us to the beach. And we can save all these 138 men aboard the Star of Bengal. So the next step after the ladder is they put a lifeboat in the davits. It's called a Columbia River style boat. It can hold about 25 or 30 men. And they put it in the davits and they forget to attach a painter line. And that's just a rope that you tie to the bow of a lifeboat so that after it's done in service, you can pull it back aboard. You can use it again. Well, they forget to do that. And the forward block holding the lifeboat in the davit splits, causing the lifeboat to fall into the sea in one shape, and it doesn't fall apart, and it drifts ashore. And so everybody aboard this ship is watching their first chance at survival just drift to the beach. So they try a second lifeboat. This second lifeboat, sitting in the davits, they lower it down just a little bit to get men into it, but the ship is rocking so heavily in the pounding wind and the waves that this lifeboat smashes against the iron hull of the Star of Bengal and it splinters into pieces. So of 6 lifeboats aboard this ship, 2 are lost. So they put everything on hold, and the captain orders breakfast for the crew. Still today, it's the only abandoned ship I've ever heard of that was put on hold to eat breakfast. They go from trying to self-rescue to realizing we've got problems, and so they stop. Of course, mathematically, things have changed. They had 6 lifeboats that could hold about 25 men each. Now they're just down to 4 lifeboats. And this means that in order to rescue everybody, they're going to have to get lifeboats off the ship, completely full, to the beach and back, up to the ship, fill them up again. It just changes the equation. So they stop for breakfast. And they come up with a plan. Instead of filling the lifeboats full of men, and this is around 7 or 8 in the morning, they decide we're going to use the breeches buoy. A breeches buoy is basically like a zip line. It's a rope it's connected on wheels, and you can put a man inside of it. He puts it around his waist, he steps into it, and you go across like a zip line from the ship to the shore. So to do that, they ask for volunteers. 4 members of the crew step forward to take a lifeboat with a rope to shore, where they would tie it to a tree, and then they would have all the remaining people aboard the ship take this breeches buoy from the ship to the shore. And they are successful at that. They do manage to get these 4 crew members into a lifeboat. They lower it. As soon as they hit the water, they cut the rope with axes and they paddle to save their lives to get to the shore. As soon as they get to the shore, their lifeboat smashes on the rocks, but they still have that rope. They tie it to a tree, and everybody on board cheers. They think, this is our chance. They ask for a volunteer. A man named Martin Carstensen, who was the ship's carpenter, volunteers to be the test dummy. He gets into the breeches buoy on board the Star of Bengal. He starts going across the zip line, and he gets about halfway. And you can imagine a zip line if it's not taut, if it's not higher at one end and lower at the other, if there's a sag in the middle, which there is. Martin Carstensen gets about halfway across, and as the ship is rolling and rocking, he gets dunked, plunged into the water, and then the ship rolls back and the line becomes taut and he gets flung into the air, dipped into the water, flung into the air, dipped into the water, flung into the air, until he is flown free of the breeches buoy, lands in the water, but thankfully his comrades on the beach are able to fish him out of the water.
Oh my
So
goodness.
in all, the Star of Bengal is able to self-rescue 5 men. Because what immediately happens after Martin Carstensen is pulled out of the surf, the ship begins to hit the rocks.
Wow, that is harrowing.
Yeah. Yeah.
I've read a lot of stories about breeches buoys, but never one like that. That's really amazing.
Yeah, it was scary. There was another volunteer named Norman Hawkins, who was the brother-in-law of the cannery superintendent. And he got into it on the ship, and he got cold feet, and he said, I'm not doing this. And so that's where Martin Carstensen stepped up. It was clearly scary to everybody. This was a dire last chance. And so Martin Carstensen survived just barely.
And of course, at this time, the weather is still poor. The waves and wind are still crashing against the ship, and like you said, rocking it back and forth,
Yeah.
making rescue very difficult.
Yeah.
And from that same part of the world, that just reminds me of an episode I did about the Princess Sophia
Yes.
that wrecked up off the coast of Juneau on Vanderbilt Reef. They were stuck on the reef for days, waiting for the weather to calm down so they could launch the lifeboats, and they never could. And then the hull was breached and it slipped off the reef, and everybody on board died except one dog.
Isn't that incredible? Yeah.
Really interesting story. If anybody hasn't heard it, look back in the archives. Okay, so now we have 5 men ashore alive,
Mm-hmm.
and the rest are on the rocks. What happens to the rest of the men on the ship?
So we've got 133 men on board the ship. Most of these men are cannery workers. They've been inside the hold of the ship, and we've got a smaller crew, around 20 or so white men. But everybody inside the ship, all the cannery workers, are Chinese, Japanese, or Filipino. And this is the greatest contention in the Star of Bengal story. This is the one where the legend will likely exist forever, but the story that has been told for as long as this shipwreck has been around is that the cannery workers were locked inside the ship as it sank, that they were
Oh,
locked inside the hold, that they were under the deck as the ship began to pound upon the rocks and to break up and to sink. I was raised with that story. My first introduction to the Star of Bengal was through my mother, who heard it from an elder in our town who was in his 80s, who loved telling stories about Wrangell history. His name was Bill Taylor, and he passed that story to her, and she passed it to me. And that's been the conventional wisdom, even as far back as when the news of the wreck arrived to the newspapers. In my research, what I unearthed is that the earliest newspapers report that all the cannery workers were brought on deck and they were placed inside of life jackets. That's universal from the testimony, from the newspaper accounts, even the remembrances from years later. But what is perhaps as grim or maybe even worse than locking the men inside the deck is that there was a panic aboard the deck. These cannery workers were not necessarily experienced seamen. They were city guys who took a job working a cannery canning salmon for the summer. They weren't necessarily mariners. And so the newspaper reports from the time suggest that there was a panic aboard the ship, that men began to fight each other, to fight the crew, but then they began to climb the rigging of the Star of Bengal. As you've probably seen on a sailing ship, you're something like a canopy of ropes all along. There's rope lines and rope ladders. And so, in their panic, knowing that the ship is going to go down, cannery workers begin climbing up the ropes, hoping that the ship will sink, but I'll be above the water. Tragically, what happens, though, is that as the ship begins to strike the rocks, as the waves lift it up and drop it down on the rocks, all that vibration rattles through the hull, up into the ropes, through the masts, and men begin falling to the concrete weather deck below. And so there's tremendous loss of life even before men get off of the ship. The eyewitnesses describe the forward mast breaking and going down first, then the mast in the middle, and the mast in the back. And so the ship is breaking into about 2 to 3 pieces. And as it's doing that, it's disgorging its cargo of 52,062 wooden cases of canned salmon. This is, in effect, what these men have spent all summer producing. And these boxes of canned salmon are extremely heavy, but they do float. And so as the ship is breaking up and men are entering the surf, so are tens of thousands of cases of canned salmon, oil drums, there's wreckage from the ship, rope line and everything. And so you have this really horrific event where this small little bite of water is full of 133 men fighting for their lives against all of this cargo. And the eyewitnesses describe the greatest loss of life is because of those boxes of canned salmon that are
mm,
effectively, as the waves are pushing, they're seeing waves of boxes of salmon. The 5 men on the beach are effectively left to try to pull men out of the wreckage. They're pulling boxes off of people on the beach and trying to save them. They're seeing men shout, "Can you get me? Can you get me?" And then a wave comes and they don't see that guy ever again. So there's a tremendous loss of life. In the end, 111 men lose their lives in the wrecking of the Star of Bengal. 27 survive.
I, that's just chaos. I'm thinking, visualizing this in my head of all these really heavy cases. How much they weigh, I don't know, but I can imagine. And they're being jostled around in the water, and some of the men probably got smashed in between,
Yep.
crushed, falling from a wave as they're trying to get into the surf. Oh my God, it's unimaginable.
Yeah.
It's just awful.
There's enough beach for them to be on, but they're surrounded by a rocky perimeter. So the survivors, yes, they're trying to rescue people. And even as late as the night, the 20th after the wreck, they're still finding people on the beach. They're hearing cries. And so they're pulling people out, but they can't escape. They can't go anywhere else. They are stuck there for days as remains are washing ashore. There's a diurnal tide there in Southeast Alaska. So in the mornings at the low tide, the eyewitnesses describe going out to collect the remains of people. And to the ethos of the era, they segregate the survivors based on race. The Asian cannery workers, their remains are put in one place, and the white men are stored in a separate place. So even in the midst of this awful tragedy that sort of equalizes all of us, there's still this distinction between class and race that's happening there too.
Yeah. And a lot of times, even as late as when this happened, the law enforcement, if there were any on site, had to be concerned about looting. Not just the cargo, but of any of the human victims. They didn't want anybody going through their pockets or taking their rings or even, in some cases, gold teeth or something like that.
Right.
It's horrible. And to our modern sensitivities, it sounds just barbaric, but it happened. Sadly, it's just human nature.
Yeah.
I'm sure that was a concern as well.
Yeah. In fact, subsequent to the wreck, the survivors were out there for about 2 days. They were eventually rescued. The tugboats, the weather got good enough that they could come back and they could get everybody off the beach, then bring them back to Wrangell. But subsequently, the Alaska Packers Association sent a crew of men out there to bury all the Chinese, Japanese, and Filipino bodies there on the beach, and they're still there to this day. But the white remains were brought back to San Francisco to be reunited with families. So even to this day, there are remains out there.
Wow. So at that spot where they were buried, is there a marker or did they make any kind of cemetery or is just lost to time?
Really exciting. Recently, there's been some groups that have gone out there in the name of science and research to study the wreck site. And I've been communicating with them and sharing research with them. And they indicate to me there's nothing like a marker, something like a brass tablet or any sort of memorial that's out there to indicate that there are remains there. But there is a spot where it's very clear that the soil has been disturbed because it's not like anything else around it. So that's what they have out there now.
That's heartbreaking.
Yeah.
And the rest of the victims that were white, they were all sent to San Francisco.
Yeah, that's right. With the exception of one man named Patrick Loftus, who was from Wrangell. He was just a cook. He was literally just there to cook for the guys. So he stayed in Wrangell with injuries. But yeah, all the other white survivors were taken down to San Francisco aboard a steamship down to Seattle, where they then took a train. And once in San Francisco, around early October, this is where Captain Nicholas Wagner's fury that began the night the ship was lost against the rocks really takes off, because he makes formal accusations that the captains of the tugs were cowards, that there was a window of time where the steamships could have come alongside the Star of Bengal and rescued everybody. And so that launches an investigation that lasts for several months, that happens in San Francisco and in Seattle and in Alaska, where these accusations of cowardice are pursued, knowing that the biggest legend about the Star of Bengal is that the cannery workers were locked inside the ship. That's the story that has followed this shipwreck for so long. That occupies very little of the investigation. The investigation is really focused on, could the captains of the steamships really saved anybody on the Star of Bengal?
What was the result of that investigation?
So again, there's a lot of controversies about the Star of Bengal. The investigators from Alaska were granted the privilege of issuing the final report on the wreck of the Star of Bengal. And it's in Alaska that the investigators get to talk to one of the crew members from the Star of Bengal, a guy named Alf Olson, who's actually the last man fished out of the water on the beach that day. And Alf Olson retracts everything he said in San Francisco about the steamship captains being coward. Alf Olson says there was no way we could have been rescued. The seas were far too rough. And there's a lot of evidence to support what Alf Olson says, such as the ship was dragging at anchor, and the eyewitnesses say the ship was dragging at anchor, which really suggests strong winds, high seas, not the kind of scenario where a steamboat could come alongside this massive sailing ship and rescue anybody. So the Alaska inspectors take away the license of Nicholas Wagner, the captain of the Star of Bengal. And Nicholas Wagner continues his protests, and it comes finally before the head of the Steamship Inspection Agency on the West Coast, a man named John Birmingham. And John Birmingham writes a report that exonerates Nicholas Wagner and restores his license to be a captain. And in the end, nobody is blamed. Nobody is held criminally responsible or liable at all. Despite this, the Alaska Packers fire Nicholas Wagner, and he is no longer a captain for the Alaska Packers Association. So really from the start, Nicholas Wagner, he starts the fire that is the blame game of blaming the steamship captains, and he's the one that leads to the inspection of this one very specific issue. Was there cowardice? Could they have been rescued? And in the end, to this day, I think some people might debate. I come down on the side of rescue was absolutely impossible. The charges of cowardice were ludicrous and unrealistic because in such dangerous seas, myself, I grew up commercial fishing in Southeast Alaska. I understand what it's like to be pushed around by the waves, and I don't think there was any chance to rescue anybody off the Star of Bengal that day.
I tend to agree with you in not knowing the story as intimately as you, but you can't just pull a ship alongside another ship and have everybody just get on. That's
Right.
not how it works.
No.
It sounds very eloquent and easy, but that is not how it works. It's very difficult and very dangerous
Yeah,
to transfer people from one ship to another.
absolutely.
So, given your description and what I've read about the story, it certainly seems that the weather and the waves and the wind was not going to cooperate with any kind of rescue, at least not in that fashion. So
Absolutely not.
the tugboat captains were saving themselves. Granted, that may seem selfish, but it's not going to help anybody if they also crash into the rocks.
That's right. That's right.
So,
And the word suicide. It would have been suicide if we had gone along the Star of Bengal.
yeah.
And that's realistic. Nicholas Wagner never let it go. He continued to blame the tug captains. And he made such an impression on his little 5-year-old daughter, Helen, that when Helen grew up, she wrote a book called Cradle of the Deep, which was published and was a bestseller in 1929. And in the very center of this book, it's a story about her growing up at sea. It's grossly embellished, but she tells a story from her father's point of view of the Star of Bengal wreck. The chapter is called "The Sea Gives Up Its Dead." And to blame the captains. It accused the captains of the tugs of being drunk and working against each other, not knowing how to pull together. They're pulling in opposite directions. And that chapter, for almost a century now, has been heavily cited in past scholarship of the Star of Bengal as just yet another eyewitness testimony to the incompetence of the captains. So the story never really ends. It just keeps going.
As these things tend to do,
Yeah.
unfortunately, we don't always have all the information, or the information that we do have is questionable. But as a result of all of this, what actually was the fate of the ship itself?
So the Star of Bengal completely wrecks on the 20th. The rescue vessels, when they come, not only just seeing the water and the beach littered with boxes of canned salmon, they can see the spars sticking out of the water. And that's been the Star of Bengal's watery grave ever since. For years following, people described being able to see the Star of Bengal through the water at low tide. And the ship's location has gone on to be something of an open secret. People knew where it was, but they didn't want to tell because they worry about people spoiling the wreck site. It is a watery grave, don't want to desecrate it. But there have been divers who have gone down on their own volition and retrieved certain artifacts from the ship. There are laws protecting the ship from things like that. So, what's really exciting is that this year there was a sanctioned dive of the Star of Bengal. A group went out of expert divers to the wreck site and they retrieved this incredible brass bell from the Star of Bengal. And it's in beautiful condition. It's just been sitting at the bottom of the sea in about 70 feet of water for 117 years. And they brought it back to Wrangell and they've cleaned it up and they actually struck it. And so we can hear that bell from the Star of Bengal. It is exciting. This has never been a better time to study and learn about the Star of Bengal.
Other than the bell, are there any other artifacts or monuments or plaques or anything like that honors the legacy or the memory of the Star of Bengal?
There is a wonderful memorial in Wrangell today. Finally, a memorial to the Star of Bengal. And as far as I know, it's the only memorial anywhere in the world. In Wrangell, near Heritage Harbor, it is a beautiful piece of glass that looks like a porthole, but they've put into the glass an image of the Star of Bengal. And it's a very popular site for people to come and visit. It's a memorial not just to Star of Bengal, but other people who have served in the fisheries and passed away. And so it's finally come to pass that the Star of Bengal is recognized. It is an important piece of the history of canneries in Alaska. Just the sheer loss of life, 111 men dying, makes it something you can't forget. The Princess Sophia is the only other wreck with more loss of life in Alaska. So Star of Bengal is quite significant. I know,
Especially when you think about the percentage,
yeah,
111 out of 138, I believe you
yes,
said.
yeah,
That is just, when you have such a high percentage of deaths like that, that it speaks to how desperate of a situation that it was.
yeah,
That escape or survival was very unlikely for anyone.
absolutely. And I'm part of a group too that is working to get the wreck site placed on the National Register
Mm.
of Historic Places. So I'm contributing some of the historical piece of that application so we can honor the site that way. There's talk about possibly leaving some kind of monument there on Coronation Island. So it is about the remoteness of the site, the confusion around the wreck. It was not really properly memorialized until recent years.
Well, like a lot of stories, I think this one falls into the same category of events that took place around that time or shortly after overshadow it.
Yeah.
Obviously, what comes to mind are things like shortly before that, the San Francisco fire in 1906,
Mm-hmm.
the sinking of the Titanic, the Lusitania, and of course, World War One. All of those things were bigger news, more deaths, more catastrophic. And so some of these other ones, even though, the loss of over 100 lives, even a single life, is tragic, they just get overshadowed with the news. And partially that has to do with, like you said, the remoteness of the location. And I hate to say it, but it's true that the people that were on board were simply not very important in terms of the consciousness of people. And I don't agree with that personally, but that is the mindset at the time. There were no wealthy oil magnates on board
Right.
or newspaper publishers or anybody or celebrities. Those tend to get forgotten more easily.
Your point is fully valid. In fact, one piece of the story that we don't have, that the group that I've been involved with, we are just so eager to find someday. We don't know the names of the Chinese, Japanese, and Filipino workers who died on that wreck.
That's sad.
The Alaska Packers Association worked by a contract system. All those cannery workers were hired by a third-party company as contractors. I had a chance to go to Bellingham, Washington, and go through the APA archives and look at the original books that they kept and all the records they kept. And there's no list of who those men were who died on that wreck. They went onto that ship and they never came home, and we have no way of honoring them. We have no idea who they were. So if somehow that should come to pass in my lifetime, that we are able to, that would be thrilling. It would be incorporated into the Mariners Memorial in Wrangell. It would be a really big deal if we could find that.
I would personally like to see some kind of historical marker at
Mm-hmm.
the site,
Yeah.
just remembering that those people are buried there. We may never know their names,
Mm-hmm.
but they're buried there. They were human beings, families with lives, and despite not knowing who they were, there should be a remembrance of some kind.
Yeah, you're not alone. People who hear this story feel very much the same way. This story has lived now for 117 years as a piece of local lore in Alaska. The kind of story that fishermen who are in the area tell each other when they pass by Coronation Island. Oh, that's Coronation Island. That's where the Star of Bengal went down. That's where the men were locked inside the ship when it sank. And it's been a word of mouth legend passed down through generations. And the fact that it survived that way, I think, says something good about us, our desire to remember the dead and to honor the dead and to recognize the people who worked in the fisheries before us. So, the research I've done and the story I've told, I really hope that I can continue that. I can boost that story and maybe raise the profile enough that, in fact, after I released my podcast, Rise and Fall of the Star of Bengal in 2022, people came forward with pieces of the story. I had a man originally from Ketchikan, Alaska, give me a tape recording of his grandfather who was aboard one of the towboats, telling in
Wow.
detail what he saw. Yeah, his grandfather's name was James Kennedy. And so I was able to clean up the audio and I released it as an episode. And you can hear James Kennedy, the engineer aboard the kayak, saying what he saw and giving more details. And so I'm just optimistic that there are more pieces of the story out there just waiting to be discovered.
Speaking of your story and your podcast, as I said at the top of the episode, you did a multi part, I believe 5 episodes plus some bonus content, and you go into a lot of detail about this story, much more so than we presented here. And we're going on almost an hour of recording so
Mm-hmm.
far before editing. But even with the impressive amount of detail you've given me now, your podcast goes into a lot more detail. And the production value, I love, by the way.
Oh, thank you.
I love the way you tell stories. Really well done.
Thanks.
What more can you say about your story to encourage listeners to listen to the whole multi part series about the Star of Bengal?
I think that, Rich, what you've discovered in telling stories about shipwrecks is what I've discovered is that there is something about a shipwreck story that just grabs you. The hubris, it's becomes man versus machine, man versus God, man versus nature. A shipwreck story is really an allegory for our lives sometimes. How everything is going fine, and then suddenly one thing can change, and we are powerless to control, and our own creation suddenly becomes something that turns on us. I did all that detail and I told as full a story as I possibly could because I wanted to honor the people that lost their lives in that wreck. And that's what's really, I think, so noble and exciting about studying shipwrecks is that you do a service to people who have been lost. And a shipwreck from ancient Greece, the Titanic sinking, or a shipwreck today, they all have a lot in common. Even the Costa Concordia, you did a wonderful episode about that. There are universal truths about what happened to people on boats when things start going wrong, and those universal truths do not change. And so I really look at the study of a shipwreck as a chance to prepare yourself, understand something about the world and life, and just expand your horizons.
That is very eloquently said, and it is exactly how I feel. There is so much to these stories, so many things that happen that lead up to that point. It's not just one thing, it's not just the weather or just one person's decision. There's economics, weather, politics, geography, all kinds of things. And as they come together, they shape the story. And all of these people involved are impacted. And as you very well said, the reason I tell these stories is because these people shouldn't be forgotten. We can't name every single person, but the story needs to be remembered. And that's why I do this.
Yeah, that's beautiful. That's great. Yeah.
Your podcast is Wrangell History Unlocked. And where can everybody find and listen to your podcast?
You can come to my website, wranglehistoryunlocked.com, and you can find Wrangell History Unlocked on any podcast streaming service.
Ronan Rooney, it has been an absolute pleasure to speak with you about this. And the Star of Bengal story is fascinating. It was very much an honor to meet you and have you on the show. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Rich. Thank you.